A black businesswoman, fresh from closing a high-profile deal overseas, was ready to return home to celebrate her success. But the moment she entered the private jet terminal, everything shifted. A front desk attendant, cold and dismissive, questioned her presence, refusing to acknowledge her reservation. Despite presenting valid documents, she was humiliated in front of other passengers. Just 12 minutes later, the attendant was escorted out, dismissed on the spot. What unfolded next sparked a reckoning across the entire company, setting off a ripple effect that reached far beyond that airport. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories of resilience and justice inspire you, hit that subscribe button for more. This was supposed to be just another flight, but what happened next changed everything. The sun hung low, a quiet sentinel over the private jet terminal, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the polished marble floor. Naomi Reed stepped from the back of the sleek black car, her heels tapping a rhythmic staccato against the pavement. She wasn't in a rush. Naomi rarely was, but there was a deliberateness to the way she carried herself. A quiet confidence, the kind that had been carved from years of navigating rooms where she was often the only one who looked like her. The terminal gleamed under the late morning light, glass walls rising to meet vaulted ceilings. Everything about the space whispered exclusivity, the kind reserved for those whose names opened doors before they even arrived. Naomi's name, she knew, held power now, but power didn't erase the weight she felt pressing down on her shoulders with every step. She adjusted the tailored blazer draped over her frame, the soft dove gray fabric catching the sunlight. Beneath it, her crisp white shirt and dark trousers spoke of quiet authority, not ostentation. Naomi had long since mastered the delicate balance of standing out without being flashy. It was armor, of a kind. At the reception desk, a young blonde woman stood behind the counter, her uniform neat, her posture stiff with the kind of rigid politeness Naomi recognized immediately. Rebecca, the name printed neatly on her gold name tag, lifted her eyes from the monitor. Their gazes met for half a second before Naomi watched Rebecca's expression shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around the eyes, the faintest downturn of her mouth. Naomi didn't need more than that. She approached with a measured smile. "Good morning," Naomi began, her voice warm but steady. "I have a reservation for Jet 7. Departing at noon. Naomi Reed." Rebecca's eyes flicked down, skimming Naomi's face, then her blazer, as if assessing whether the name and the person truly belonged together. "Jet 7? Rebecca repeated, her tone lingering just a little too long on the question, as though she were processing the improbability of it. Naomi nodded, producing her identification and confirmation with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. She set them on the counter between them like playing cards laid down in a game neither had agreed to play. Rebecca hesitated before taking them, her fingers grazing the edge of the paper as if the touch alone might confirm or deny its legitimacy. She glanced at the document, eyes narrowing just slightly. "There doesn't seem to be anything under this name in our system," Rebecca said, the words delivered with a kind of rehearsed ease. Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose. "Not yet. I confirmed the reservation with my assistant yesterday," Naomi replied, her voice even. "Would you mind checking again?" Rebecca's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, turning back to the monitor with deliberate slowness. Her manicured nails clicked against the keyboard in measured taps. Naomi watched her out of the corner of her eye, feeling the subtle shift in the room behind her. She could sense the curiosity from the other passengers in the lounge, the weight of their glances sliding over her like invisible threads. It was the same unspoken question she had heard in restaurants, boutiques, and boardrooms. "Why is she here?" Rebecca's typing slowed, her brows furrowing in faint theatrical concern. "I'm sorry, Ms. Reed," she said after a long pause, her tone laced with something that could almost be mistaken for regret. "I'm just not finding anything." Naomi's grip on her leather bag tightened. "I'd like to speak with a manager," she said, her voice soft but firm. Rebecca's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile Naomi had learned to distrust. "I don't think that will be necessary," she replied. "It's likely just a mix-up. But I can assure you that without a reservation in the system, I won't be able to allow you through the terminal." Naomi held her gaze for a long moment. This was not about a mix-up. It never was. She straightened, squaring her shoulders as the familiar pulse of frustration began to hum beneath her calm exterior. "Rebecca, I'd like you to double-check. This reservation was made weeks ago. I have the documentation right here. Please." Rebecca hesitated. Naomi saw the flicker of something like defiance or discomfort crossing her face. But before Rebecca could respond, the quiet murmur of voices from the lounge grew louder. And Naomi felt the shift in the air. A few of the other passengers, 2 men in tailored suits, had turned their heads just slightly, their eyes darting in her direction. Naomi met their gaze briefly before looking away. Rebecca finally reached for the phone on the counter. "Let me call security," she said, her voice light, as if the suggestion were merely procedural. Naomi felt something settle in her chest, something weighty, yet familiar. She had seen this play out before. But this time, she wasn't leaving. The phone call was not immediate. Naomi watched Rebecca's hand hover just above the receiver, as if she were deciding whether Naomi's presence warranted such escalation. That hesitation, it said more than the words that would follow. Naomi had seen it before. In grocery stores and government offices. In the casual glance of a neighbor or the slow rise of an eyebrow from a waiter who had assumed she couldn't afford the wine she ordered. The hesitation was Rebecca asking herself, "Am I overreacting?" And the silence that stretched between them was Naomi asking herself, "Should I have to explain this?" Rebecca lowered the receiver without dialing. "I can try checking one more time," she said, her tone clipped, but Naomi could hear the reluctance curling at the edges of her voice. "That would be appreciated," Naomi replied, though there was no gratitude in her voice, only the kind of politeness that served as a thin veil over simmering frustration. Rebecca returned to the screen, her fingers moving slower now, more for show than for purpose. Naomi stood still, not leaning on the counter, not shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She knew better than to let them see her discomfort. Behind her, the soft murmurs of conversation resumed. But now they carried a different tone, quieter, more pointed. Naomi didn't need to turn around to know that eyes were lingering. The thing about prejudice, Naomi thought, is that it rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in through the cracks, fills the empty spaces between polite words and gestures. It's in the way people say, "Ma'am," with just the slightest edge of condescension. Or how they pause for a half-second too long before deciding whether to hold the door open. And yet, it carries weight, a heavy, unrelenting thing that presses down until your bones grow weary of holding it up. "Still nothing," Rebecca said at last, the faintest glint of satisfaction flickering behind her eyes as she turned away from the monitor. "I'm afraid without a reservation, I really can't allow you to board." Naomi let the words hang in the air for a moment. Let Rebecca hear them herself. "I see," Naomi said quietly, though her tone did not betray the quiet storm beginning to gather beneath her ribs. "I assume you've tried searching under the flight number as well?" Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. She hesitated before responding, and Naomi knew she hadn't. Naomi opened her bag, pulling out the neatly folded itinerary, the logo of the terminal embossed at the top. She placed it on the counter with a measured slowness. "Here," she said, sliding the paper closer. "My flight number, gate assignment, departure time." Rebecca's eyes flicked to the document, but her hands didn't move. She didn't pick it up. For a second, Naomi wondered if this was the moment Rebecca would break the facade of professionalism. If she would say what lingered unsaid between them. But instead, Rebecca smiled tightly. "Sometimes these things just happen. Systems fail. It's nothing personal." Naomi's gaze hardened, but her voice remained steady. "It feels personal." Rebecca's smile didn't falter, but Naomi caught the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth. "I can get the manager, if you'd like," Rebecca offered, as if she were doing Naomi a favor. "Yes," Naomi said simply. Rebecca nodded, disappearing through a side door, leaving Naomi standing alone at the counter. And in that silence, Naomi could feel the weight of the room shifting again. A woman near the window, a blonde, older, perhaps in her 60s, offered Naomi a small smile, the kind that hovered somewhere between pity and discomfort. Naomi returned it with a polite nod, though the gesture left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had long grown tired of the "I'm so sorry this is happening to you" expressions from strangers. They were the kind of smiles that held no real power, no risk. It was easy to smile at injustice when you were certain it wouldn't follow you home. The terminal manager arrived 5 minutes later. his stride purposeful but his eyes tired. He was a man who had handled countless customer complaints but rarely ones like this. His name tag read, Graham. His suit, though sharp, bore the faint wrinkles of someone who had been at work far longer than intended. "Ms. Reed, is it?" Graham asked, extending his hand. "Yes," Naomi replied, shaking it firmly. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your reservation?" His tone was carefully neutral, the voice of someone who wished to resolve the issue without digging too deeply into why it had arisen in the first place. "There shouldn't be any confusion," Naomi said, handing him the itinerary. "My reservation was confirmed yesterday." Graham studied the paper, his brow furrowing slightly. He nodded as he glanced over it. "This looks in order," he admitted, lifting his eyes toward the screen Rebecca had left open behind the counter. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, pulling up the same system Naomi had watched Rebecca fumble with. A moment later, he exhaled through his nose. "Here it is," Graham said, as if the discovery were more inconvenient than surprising. "There was a small error in the entry. Apologies for the mix-up." Naomi said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Graham cleared his throat. "I'll make sure you're escorted to the gate personally. Would you like anything while you wait?" Naomi smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I'd like to know why this wasn't found the first time," she said softly, her eyes steady on his. Graham hesitated. "I can assure you it won't happen again." "I'm sure it won't," Naomi replied. As Graham signaled for another attendant to escort her, Naomi glanced toward Rebecca, who had returned to her post, eyes fixed on the monitor as if nothing had happened. Naomi didn't need to confront her. The silence between them was confrontation enough. But as she followed the attendant toward the glass-walled corridor leading to the jet, Naomi couldn't help but feel that familiar weight settle over her once more. The battle had been won. But the war? The war was still far from over. Naomi's footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor as she followed the attendant down the corridor. The air in the terminal felt heavier now, as if the confrontation at the front desk had unsettled more than just her reservation. The hum of whispered conversations flickered behind her like static, subtle but ever present. She did not look back. It was not that Naomi was unused to the quiet attention she carried that weighed every day. Wore it like an old coat whose seams were fraying but could not yet be discarded. What lingered now was something sharper. A quiet anger, tempered but unrelenting. The attendant leading her, someone younger, earnest, and eager to avoid eye contact, stayed a step ahead, speaking only to indicate where to turn. Naomi appreciated the silence. Sometimes, words could cheapen a moment. At the private lounge near Gate 7, the attendant paused. "Ms. Reed, you're welcome to wait here. Your flight crew will be ready to board in 30 minutes. Naomi nodded, offering a polite, "Thank you," though her voice felt distant to her own ears. She stepped inside the lounge, the door clicking shut softly behind her. The room was pristine, designed to exude comfort without warmth. Low leather armchairs, brushed steel fixtures, and minimalist art prints along the walls. The kind of space that felt as if it had been meticulously crafted to appear effortless. Though Naomi knew better, she lowered herself into one of the armchairs. Her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't check her phone, didn't reach for her tablet. Instead, she let herself sit in the quiet, allowing the tension to stretch out beside her like an unwelcome guest. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the tarmac shimmered under the noon sun. Her jet sat just beyond the glass, sleek and silver, reflecting the sky above. Naomi's gaze lingered on the horizon, but her thoughts stayed behind at the reception desk. It would have been easy to dismiss what happened as a clerical error, a misunderstanding wrapped in politeness. Easier still to leave it behind with nothing more than a weary exhale. But Naomi could not shake the feeling that to let it go meant to excuse it. And how many times had that been the easier choice? She thought back to her father, who once told her that dignity was not something you earned, it was something you defended. "They'll take it from you, piece by piece," he'd said, "and if you're not careful, one day you'll look up and find nothing left of it but dust in your hands." Naomi was still staring out at the tarmac when the door behind her opened. The soft scuff of shoes on the polished floor broke the stillness. "Ms. Reed?" She turned, meeting the eyes of the terminal manager Graham. He stood just inside the lounge, his hands clasped in front of him, that same careful expression etched onto his face. "I apologize for interrupting." Graham began, his voice measured. I just wanted to check in personally. I understand there was an issue earlier. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, though her posture remained relaxed. Yes, she replied, keeping her tone even. There was. Graham shifted his weight, offering the kind of smile Naomi recognized as a shield, a thin barrier between discomfort and accountability. I spoke to Rebecca, he continued, glancing toward the floor before returning his gaze to Naomi. She insisted it was a misunderstanding, a mistake with the system. Naomi let the silence settle between them, unbroken and heavy. She did not offer him the comfort of absolution. Graham cleared his throat, pressing forward. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. I'll make sure it's addressed. Naomi's lips curved into something that could barely be called a smile. You'll address it, she repeated, her voice soft but deliberate. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Graham blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Well, for starters, he said, adjusting his tie, Rebecca will receive additional training. Sensitivity workshops. It's something we've been expanding across our staff. Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the arms of the chair. I don't believe sensitivity was the issue, she said quietly, but the weight in her voice filled the room. Graham hesitated, unsure whether to nod or stand his ground. Naomi continued, her words precise and deliberate. This isn't about a mistake in the system or a lack of awareness. Rebecca knew exactly what she was doing. Graham opened his mouth, but Naomi lifted her hand, halting him. She saw me, Naomi said, her gaze unwavering, and she decided without reason that I didn't belong here. For a long moment, the only sound in the lounge was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Graham shifted, the confidence he had walked in with now sitting uneasily on his shoulders. Ms. Reed, Naomi's eyes met his, sharp and unwavering. I've been doing this long enough, she said softly, to know when someone is trying to minimize a situation. And I promise you, this will not be minimized. Graham nodded, the weight of her words anchoring him in place. I understand, he said finally. I'll see to it personally. Naomi sat back, watching as Graham excused himself and left the room, his steps quieter than when he arrived. As the door clicked shut behind him, Naomi returned her gaze to the tarmac. There was no satisfaction in what had just transpired, only the familiar exhaustion that followed moments like these. She had not won anything. She had simply held the line. And the line, as always, was thin. Naomi remained seated long after Graham left, her reflection faintly visible in the floor-to-ceiling glass as the jet outside shimmered under the midday sun. The world outside moved, but inside that lounge, time seemed to still itself around her. She could hear the faint clinking of glasses from the bar area across the room, the soft murmurs of distant conversations. But none of it touched her. There was a rhythm to moments like these, a silence that stretched taut between anger and exhaustion. Naomi leaned back, the leather of the chair cool against her skin, her hands folded in her lap. The memory of Rebecca's smirk lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. It would have been easy, too easy, to let it pass, to let Graham's carefully constructed apology paper over the cracks and call it done. But Naomi had spent a lifetime learning that cracks left untended always grew wider. And if they didn't swallow you whole, they swallowed the next person behind you. As she watched the plane outside, the thought pressed heavier on her chest. How many times had she sat in rooms like this? In boardrooms, at conferences, at dinners hosted by people who smiled wide but left her seat just a little too far from the table. It wasn't the overt acts of exclusion that wore you down. It was the thousand small moments of erasure. A voice cut through the quiet. Excuse me. Naomi turned her head. A man late 50s, maybe early 60s, stood a few feet away. His suit crisp but slightly wrinkled at the elbows. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and he carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to moving through spaces like this. But there was hesitation in his eyes now, uncertainty in the way he shifted his weight. I couldn't help but notice, earlier. He gestured vaguely toward the reception desk, his words trailing off as if unsure how to finish the sentence. Naomi said nothing at first, letting him sit with his own discomfort. Finally, she offered a polite nod. Yes? He cleared his throat. I just wanted to say I thought you handled that well. Gracefully. I mean. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. She could hear the unsaid words beneath his compliment. I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd lost your temper. But Naomi didn't thank him. Instead, she let the quiet linger between them, watching the faint flicker of unease cross his face. I'm Richard, by the way, he added, as though offering his name might soften the edges of the moment. Naomi, she replied, though she suspected he already knew. Richard nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets. You know, I've flown through here for years. Never seen anything like that. Naomi raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. I imagine you wouldn't. The air between them shifted. And for a brief second, Richard's face tightened, as if he were unsure whether to feel insulted or enlightened. I didn't mean, he began. But Naomi cut him off gently. I know you didn't, she said, her voice soft but firm. Richard exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in the way people exhale when they realize a conversation won't let them retreat into comfort. After a pause, he spoke again, this time with less polish. It's different for you, he admitted, his eyes dropping to the floor. I suppose I never really thought about it. What that must be like. Naomi let out a quiet breath, her gaze returning to the tarmac. It's not that you haven't thought about it, she replied, it's that you haven't had to. Richard opened his mouth as if to respond but found nothing to say. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. And for a brief moment, Naomi wondered if he might turn and leave. But he didn't. Instead, Richard lowered himself into the chair across from her, the space between them quiet, contemplative. After a long silence, he spoke again. My granddaughter, he said, almost to himself. Her mother's black. She's starting to ask questions about why some people look at her the way they do. I never really had the answers for that. Naomi's eyes softened. No one's born with the answers, she said, but the questions, they're a start. Richard nodded, his gaze distant. She's 7, he added, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Smart as a whip, but stubborn as hell. Naomi chuckled softly. She'll need to be. They sat in quiet companionship for a while. Two strangers tethered by the invisible thread of shared understanding. Finally, Richard stood, smoothing his suit jacket. Thank you, Naomi, for not letting it slide. Naomi met his gaze. It's not just for me, she said simply. Richard nodded once, then left the lounge, his footsteps fading into the corridor. Naomi turned back to the window. The jet was still there, waiting, its engines silent but ready. The weight on her shoulders hadn't lifted. Not entirely, but as the door closed softly behind Richard, she felt something shift. A reminder, perhaps, that even the smallest fractures of awareness could let light in. And sometimes, that light was enough to keep the fire burning. The room was empty again. Naomi's eyes lingered on the space Richard had left behind. The chair slightly askew, his absence more noticeable than his presence had been. In another world, maybe that conversation would have been enough. A polite exchange, a shared reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of believing progress, however slow, was being made. But Naomi had lived too long to mistake small gestures for seismic shifts. She reached for the glass of water on the side table, the condensation leaving a faint ring on the polished surface. The heat from the tarmac beyond the window shimmered like a distant mirage. And for a fleeting moment, she thought of how often she had stood at crossroads like this, moments heavy with the weight of decisions unmade. Naomi had learned that racism did not always arrive with sirens and burning torches. Sometimes it came dressed in the soft fabric of professionalism, carrying clipboards and polite dismissals. It thrived not in the loud, ugly corners of society but in the soft-spoken assurances that, this isn't personal. Rebecca's face flashed in her mind. The smirk, the indifference. The way she had tightened her grip on the armrest of power as if to say, I decide who belongs here. And then there was Graham. His apology had been the carefully measured kind, crafted to acknowledge but never implicate. To soothe but not disrupt. Naomi recognized the subtle geometry of it. People like Graham learned early how to apologize just enough to keep the floor beneath them from trembling. She had no interest in shattering floors. But she would not allow them to be swept clean of consequence either. Naomi stood, smoothing the front of her blazer as she walked toward the window. Her jet sat still, waiting, but Naomi was no longer sure she wanted to board just yet. Blank. 15 minutes passed before the door behind her opened again. This time, Naomi did not turn immediately. Ms. Reed? The voice belonged to Graham. His tone was polite, carefully rehearsed, but Naomi could hear the faint tremor beneath it, the uncertainty of a man who sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet but didn't yet know how far the fault lines ran. "I thought you'd left already," he continued. Naomi's reflection in the glass caught the faint shadow of him standing just behind her. His hands clasped in front of him like a student awaiting discipline. "I considered it," Naomi replied, her gaze still fixed on the jet outside. "But I don't believe we're done here." She turned, meeting his eyes. "I understand your frustration," Graham began, stepping further into the room. "I spoke with Rebecca again." Naomi held up her hand, silencing him with a glance. "Stop," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I don't need another explanation about Rebecca. I know who she is." Graham hesitated. "Ms. Reed, you're not here because you want to address Rebecca's behavior," Naomi interrupted. "You're here because you understand what happens if I decide to escalate this." Graham's mouth opened, but Naomi watched him catch the truth in her words before he could deny it. He nodded, the movement small but deliberate. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "That's part of it." Naomi took a step forward, closing the space between them. "And you should know," she said, her eyes locked on his, "that this isn't just about me. I've been here before. I know what to expect. But what happens when the next woman steps through that door and doesn't have the same leverage I do?" Graham's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "That's the part no one ever wants to address," Naomi continued, "because addressing it means admitting that Rebecca isn't the exception. She's the rule." Graham let out a slow breath, his shoulders sinking slightly beneath the weight of her words. "I don't want to pretend this is an isolated incident," he said carefully, "but I have to be honest. Ms. Reed, real change doesn't happen overnight. And not everyone will see it the way you do." Naomi smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not asking for overnight," she replied. "I'm asking for you to stop pretending the clock hasn't been ticking for centuries." Graham's eyes flickered with something Naomi couldn't quite place: guilt, perhaps, or maybe exhaustion. "Will firing Rebecca solve it?" he asked, as if daring her to say yes. Naomi shook her head. "No," she said plainly. "But keeping her will ensure nothing changes." Graham pressed his lips together, his hands shifting at his sides. Naomi let the silence sit between them until the weight of it became unbearable. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. Naomi exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough to breathe. "Start with accountability," she said, "not just for Rebecca but for yourself. You can't lead from the sidelines." Graham's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. But Naomi wasn't sure he did. Not yet. Still, it was a beginning, and beginnings, she knew, were rarely comfortable. As Graham turned to leave, Naomi's voice stopped him once more. "One more thing," she said. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "I want this in writing," Naomi added. "Every step you take from this point forward. I want a record." Graham's brow furrowed. "You don't trust me?" Naomi met his eyes with a steady calm. "It's not about trust," she replied. "It's about making sure the cracks stay visible long after I'm gone." Graham nodded once more, this time with the understanding of a man who knew he had little choice but to comply. Naomi turned back to the window as the door closed behind him. Her reflection now clearer, sharper against the glass. The jet still waited, but Naomi was no longer in a rush. Naomi remained by the window long after Graham's footsteps faded down the hall. The tarmac beyond the glass seemed distant now, as if separated from her by more than just thick panes of glass. Her jet sat still, waiting, but Naomi's gaze drifted past it to the farthest edge of the airport, where the runways met the horizon. The room behind her felt heavier, not because of its emptiness but because of the weight that rooms like this always carried. It was the kind of weight that lingered in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, country clubs, places where power was dressed in soft carpets and polished brass. Rooms remember who they were built for, and who they were not. Naomi turned slowly, letting her eyes trace the clean lines of the lounge, the perfectly arranged furniture, the art that hung deliberately off-center as if to appear casually expensive. Everything in the room existed to signal belonging. But belonging, Naomi knew, had never been about the room. It had always been about the people who sat in it and the quiet, unspoken agreements that decided who got to stay. The door opened again, but this time the footsteps were softer. Hesitant, Naomi glanced over her shoulder to see Rebecca. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rebecca's hands twisted together in front of her, her eyes flickering toward the floor as if searching for words that refused to surface. Naomi said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence had a weight of its own, and sometimes it was the heaviest thing you could place in a room. Rebecca shifted her weight from one foot to the other, but Naomi watched how carefully she kept her distance, standing just far enough from the furniture as if unsure whether she was welcome to sit. Rebecca began, but the words slipped from her mouth like something half-formed. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Waiting. I just wanted to apologize. Rebecca continued, her voice quieter now. For earlier. Naomi nodded once but didn't move to fill the silence that followed. Rebecca took a breath, forcing herself to continue. It wasn't personal. I didn't mean to. Naomi raised a hand, cutting her off as gently as one could sever a thread. You don't need to explain. Naomi said softly. I know exactly what you meant to do. Rebecca's mouth tightened, but she didn't look away. For the first time since Naomi had met her, Rebecca appeared small, not in stature but in the way people do when they realize the role they play is suddenly visible to everyone else in the room. The mask of professionalism, the polite detachment Naomi saw now that it had been less armor and more habit. And habits, once exposed, had a way of unraveling. Naomi took a slow step forward. Not enough to intimidate but enough to remind Rebecca that the distance between them could shift at any moment. You looked at me, Naomi said evenly, and you made a calculation. Rebecca swallowed, but her voice was steady. I didn't think. Yes, you did. Naomi's voice sharpened, the edges no longer soft. You thought about what I was wearing. You thought about the color of my skin. You thought about how easy it would be to dismiss me because you didn't recognize me. Rebecca's face colored slightly, but she stayed rooted where she stood. Naomi let the words linger between them, heavy and unrelenting. It's not the first time. Naomi continued, her voice softer now but no less pointed. And it won't be the last. Not for me. Not for the women who come after me. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, as if unsure whether anything she said would matter. Naomi sighed quietly, stepping back toward the window. I don't need your apology. Rebecca, Naomi said, watching the reflection of the younger woman in the glass. What I need is for you to understand that this isn't about one interaction. Rebecca shifted slightly, her reflection small beside Naomi's. You have the luxury of walking away from this moment. Naomi continued. I don't. I carry it with me. Every time I walk into a room like this, I wonder if I'll have to explain why I belong. Rebecca's hands fell to her sides. And for the first time, Naomi saw something else in her eyes, something that resembled shame but carried the weight of recognition. I'll remember that, Rebecca said softly. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. I hope you do, she replied, because the next time it happens, I won't be the one standing at this counter. It'll be someone who can't afford to be as patient as I was today. Rebecca nodded, and without another word, she turned and slipped quietly out of the room. Naomi watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The room was empty again. But this time it felt different. Perhaps rooms did remember who they were built for. But Naomi had no intention of letting them forget who had walked through them. Naomi stood by the window long after Rebecca left, the silence wrapping itself around her like a second skin. The room, despite its expensive decor and curated luxury, felt colder, now emptier, as if some essential part of it had slipped away when the door closed. Outside, the jet still waited, its silver hull gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of movement, progress, but Naomi knew better than to mistake forward motion for true arrival. She had learned long ago that standing still could happen even at 30,000 feet. Naomi's gaze drifted, catching her faint reflection in the glass. There was no triumph in her eyes, no quiet satisfaction at having stood her ground. The exhaustion, however, was unmistakable, the kind that seeped into your bones and made itself at home. Her father's voice returned to her, as it often did in moments like this. Victory, baby, isn't in winning every fight. It's in making sure they know you were there. Naomi turned from the window, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble as she crossed the room. She stopped at the lounge's entrance, hand resting on the handle. But something held her there. She wasn't ready to leave just yet. Instead, she walked slowly back to the chair she had occupied earlier, lowering herself into the cool leather. Her hands rested lightly on her knees, but her mind was elsewhere, wandering through the halls of memory, stepping over the quiet indignities she had been taught to endure since childhood. She remembered the first time someone questioned why she was there. Not here, at this airport or in this terminal, but there in a space she was told she didn't belong. It was a school auditorium. 5th grade. Naomi had won a statewide essay competition. Her father took the day off work, polished his shoes until they shone, and sat proudly in the front row as she read her piece on stage. But after the ceremony, a teacher, one she didn't even know, pulled her aside. "That was a lovely essay," the woman had said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Did someone help you write it?" Naomi didn't understand the question at first. She had smiled politely, nodded, and said, "Yes, my father." The teacher's smile thinned, as if that wasn't the answer she had expected or wanted. Later that evening, when Naomi recounted the moment at the dinner table, her father's face darkened, not with anger, but with a quiet knowing. "She wasn't asking if I helped, baby," he had said, his fork motionless in his hand. "She was asking if you could have done it on your own." Naomi remembered how her father's words sat heavily in the air between them, how he hadn't tried to explain it further. Some lessons, she realized, weren't meant to be spelled out. They were meant to settle into your skin and stay there. Now, decades later, Naomi still carried the weight of that lesson. Rebecca's face had been different from that teacher's, but the question, the quiet calculation, had been the same. "Are you sure you belong here?" Naomi let out a breath, rubbing her palms together as if trying to shake loose the residue of the past. The door opened again, but Naomi didn't turn this time. "Ms. Reed." It was Graham. His voice carried the same carefully composed tone she had heard before. But Naomi caught the slight shift beneath it, the forced humility of a man unaccustomed to discomfort. Naomi didn't rise. She let him cross the room until he stood a few paces away, his hands clasped in front of him. "I wanted to follow up," Graham said, his eyes skimming the floor for a beat before meeting hers. "I've spoken with the corporate office. There will be changes." Naomi nodded once, but said nothing. Graham shifted his weight, as if he had expected a warmer response. "I understand this isn't the first time something like this has happened," he added, "and I know words probably don't mean much at this point." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Then why offer them?" Graham hesitated. "Because I think it's important that you know I heard you," he replied, his voice quieter now. "And I'll remember." Naomi studied him carefully. There was no Rebecca-like smirk this time, just the faint weariness of a man who had glimpsed a crack in the floor beneath him and wasn't quite sure how deep it ran. But Naomi knew. She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer as she took a step toward him. "I appreciate that, Graham," she said evenly. "But the thing about cracks is that they don't stay small. They grow, unless you're willing to tear up the whole floor." Graham gave a slow nod, his gaze dropping for a brief second before returning to her. "I'll make sure this is handled," he said, more to convince himself than her. Naomi let him believe it for now. As Graham turned to leave, Naomi's voice stopped him once more. "Graham." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Change isn't measured by how uncomfortable you're willing to be for 5 minutes," Naomi said quietly. "It's measured by how uncomfortable you're willing to let your world become when no one's watching." Graham didn't respond immediately, but Naomi saw the weight of her words settle into his posture as he exited the lounge. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Naomi alone once more. She picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder, and finally made her way toward the gate. The jet was waiting, but Naomi knew that the real journey, the one that stretched far beyond this terminal, was still ahead. And she would not be standing still.